Hello. Today's video, it's about writing essays, where they're asking the question, to what extent do you agree or disagree? What we'll look at in this video is basically the vocabulary, transition phases, sentence structures, and tenses. And of course, we'll look at an entire essay as to how to write it, what the introduction looks like, what the conclusion looks like, and just what a full essay looks like. So without further ado, let's get started. So, the essay that we have, the question on hand is, some people claim that not enough of the waste from homes is recycled. They say that the only way to increase recycling is for governments to make it a legal requirement. To what extent do you think laws are needed to make people recycle more of their waste? So here, basically what the ask is, what your opinion is, what do you think that those laws are needed for recycling or not? So, when we look at an essay like this, first of all, the first and foremost thing that you want to do is basically read the entire question and see what is being asked of you. Here are a couple of things. See, the trick is, the answer for the entire essay is basically the question itself. First, they are looking at, the waste from homes that is to be recycled. Then they say that only way to increase recycling is for governments to make it legal requirement. Everything is around in these lines. So here, this bit. That's where the entire answer is hidden. So that's where you have to go. So, when, we think about this essay, it should be broken into 4 parts, okay? The first one is the introduction itself. So, in the introduction for this question itself, we will provide some background information on the issue of recycling waste. Okay, that's what we'll give a background on. This is where you should start your essay. This is the starting point. Of course, we will also give a thesis statement outlining your position, whether the laws are needed to increase recycling or they're not needed. Whatever your view is, we'll make a statement here. So that's that should be the introductory bit. Give a background on waste recycling and then give your position where you're taking this essay. In the introduction itself, the reader should know where you're taking them, right? So that should be it. Now, after the introduction, you have to think about, some ideas. Let's think about some ideas for arguments in favor, okay? This is where we start. Because before we even get started with this essay, before you start writing, what you have to do is basically start generating ideas, right? That is what you gotta do. Now, if you want to generate ideas, always look at both the sides. Are arguments in favor, arguments that are opposite of whatever is being asked of you, because that is where you have to start. So when we look at idea generation, this is how we go about it. First of all, we'll give an example of a successful recycling initiative in countries with strict laws. We'll start with that. That's a good argument that we can give. And of course, we can also discuss the potential benefits of recycling waste and having those laws in place. How does that impact basically the citizens, the government, the country, just the whole shebang, right? Finally, we'll also give a counter argument where we address concerns that mandatory recycling will have some sort of impact. So that is another thing that will, that we have arguments in favor. Now, when we talk about arguments that are against mandatory recycling, first of all, we'll talk about the limitations, of mandatory recycling. Always start with that. What are the limitations? What will be some issues that arise from mandatory recycling? We can talk about that. Then we'll also talk about alternative approaches to promoting recycling. That, what other ways can, be taken instead of government pushing laws for people to start recycling. How can we make that happen? So that is something, we'll talk about as well. After that, we give a counter argument where we address the potential effectiveness of mandatory recycling laws. So this is playing the devil's advocate, saying, hey, even though we are saying this is something that's against, but what would happen if it's not? It's always, good to look from both angles. So give a perspective on both sides. So that's basically your BP2, right? So you write your introductory paragraph. This is your BP1, where you write arguments in favor. Your BP2 is basically arguments against. And finally, you write a conclusion. Okay? Before the conclusion, of course, you can also write where you stand, what, like your point is, where do you think, what the government should do, or if mandatory recycling is important or not. Of course, you can do that. But generally speaking, you should have at least 4 paragraphs. Well, maybe not in that structure, maybe like this instead, because that's how we write. So, okay, now let's move on to the conclusion. So when you're concluding the essay, always restate the thesis and summarize key arguments that you've made. You want to give a summary of all that you've told. That is important because now you're wrapping it all up and you're saying, hey, I've made my arguments, I've made my thesis point, and this is, like where we conclude this. And finally, you can provide some final thoughts on the importance of finding a balanced approach to waste reduction and recycling. This is one way to go about it. Talk about both the things, right? We should find a balance in between. Let's not go with either side. You can always do that. But if you think you want to stick with mandatory recycling and you think that's good, make a case for that. If you think it's bad, make a case for that and stick with it. But in this essay, what I'll say is that, we should find a balance. So that's a general overview of what an essay looks like, right? So you have your introduction, then you have your BP1 where you give, like arguments in favor. Then you have your BP3 where you basically say what's, the shortcomings of this idea. Then paragraph 4 could be where you say what you think. This is tentative. Like you don't have to say that, you don't always have to write this, but if you want, you can. If you don't, you can skip it and finally write the concluding paragraph. So that's basically what an essay looks like. Now let's go on to the format of it. Well, I guess I just covered that. So that's how you go about it. You write the introduction, you write the BP1, BP2, BP3, conclusion. BP3, like I mentioned, this is optional. You don't have to write it if you don't want to, but I always say do it because it just makes you look like a better writer. That's all. This is where you state what your ideas are. Now, let's look at some vocabulary. This is the fun part. When we talk about waste recycling, there are some key words that you should be aware of. And, these words out here, you should have them in your vocabulary. You should know what they mean. Like some of these are basically from the question itself. Like if we go back and we look at, the question itself. So we have recycling, we have government, we have legal requirements. We look at like something that can come from like, requirement is like something called mandatory. Let's look at this word here. So look at this, waste recycling. Number 1, mandatory laws. Mandatory is basically something that is very important and you have to follow it and it has to be done. It's a requirement, you have to do it. That's basically what mandatory means. Of course, we can talk about, you can use the word environment. We can say resource depletion. That's a nice way of saying that something is being used up too much. So you can always say that. We can talk about recycling rate. At what rate is something being recycled? That, is 60% of the waste being recycled? What's the recycling rate? Talk about that. We can also mention sustainability practices. That's a pretty nice word to use in your essay. Mind you, this is all 8+ band. So like if you want to go somewhere there, I would use these words. But make sure you use them properly. I'll show you how it's done. I've used them in the essay. So sustainability practices is basically how you go about sustaining anything really. It could be sustaining some sort of a habit, sustaining recycling practices, sustaining your educational habits, your learning habits is something sustainable. That's basically what it is. You can talk about consumer behavior, how people consume something and how the behavior has been like. Personal freedoms, that's always a good, a couple good words you can always use whenever you talk about mandatory laws or legal requirements. And finally, enforce, that's a good word to use as well. Enforce means to put something in place by force. That's what enforcing is. Unpopular, you know what unpopular is? Opposite of popular, that's unpopular. Then we have education campaigns. Education campaigns are basically, like initiatives or these little projects started by anyone really. Could be the government, could be an NGO, could be even you, basically saying, hey, this is what you should learn. Then you can talk about you can use the words raise awareness. This basically means to bring something to people's attention or to somebody's attention so that they know what's happening. You can also use the word responsibility. Responsibility is basically saying, in a sense that's saying, hey, if you have a freedom, you also have a duty, and that duty is basically responsibility in a sense. You can talk about incentives. That's basically saying, if you do this, you get this. If you don't do this, you don't get that. That's an incentive, right? Tax breaks. Tax breaks are basically when you make some sort of income and you do something good and the government says, hey, you know what? You get a break. You don't have to pay this amount of tax. So that's good. Rebate is basically a discount. Balanced approach, that like I mentioned earlier, is basically finding a balance between something. And of course, use the word waste reduction. You can use that. Protect the environment. You know what that means. And conserve resources. That's a nice way of saying using something in less quantity. So you know what? Learn this vocabulary, these words that you have here. Like take a note of it. Like take a screenshot, write them down. I don't care. Whatever works best for you, do it. If you want to take a screenshot, here I'll just quickly clean this up. I guess, that works well. What do you know? Perfect. Now you can take a screenshot. Alright. Now, let's look at something called transition phrases. Pardon my mistake there. So basically what transition phrases are, when you have your paragraphs, right? Your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs. The idea, the information from these should flow from one to another. That's how this information should flow. Think of it like this. When you're driving a car, if you're coming to a stop, you want to come to a stop gently. You don't want to be all jerky, right? No one likes that. It gives you a shock and you're like, nah, I didn't like it. If you come to a smooth stop, that's good. That's basically what these transition phrases do. They basically help you transition from one point to the next one smoothly. That's basically what it is. And in this essay, I've used these transition phrases here. First is in recent years. It's a very good way to kind of cover a timeline of years or a period. Then you can say while some argue. That's a good way to start some sort of your opinion on something. And look at this one, on the one hand. Usually we write on one hand, but on the one hand is more accurate, and that is usually what's preferred when you write something down. So make sure you use it like this. So when you've used on the one hand, that's for 1 point. Now, when you talk about something like the opposite point, you can use on the other hand. So if on the one hand it says this is good, on the other hand it says it's not so good. That's basically how I use that. There you go. So that's how you go about it. Then you can use furthermore. That's basically, adding something to it. And then if you have more points to add, you can always use in addition. And when you're giving your opinion, use in my opinion. That'll give a nice transition. And finally, by taking a balanced approach. That's a nice line or a phrase or bunch of words that you can use. I mean, they sound beautiful. Finally, in conclusion, use that. That's how you go about concluding this. So, these are some of the transition phrases that I've used, and I would highly suggest that you use them as well. Here, let me just clean this out, and you can take a screenshot and you can use them in your essays. I highly recommend this. Now, let's look at basically what my introduction looks like. So, in my introduction, this is how I started it. In the recent years, that's a good way to open anything really. That's if you want to talk about something that's happened in the time, start with in recent years. The issue of waste recycling has become increasingly important as concerns about the environment and resource depletion have grown. See how I've used this vocabulary all together in like one sentence? That's kind of like, how you go about it. And what I'm gonna do is get my highlighter out so that you can basically see. So resource depletion, I've used this word here. Waste recycling, concerns, environment, increasingly. Look at these words, look at the way they've been used. Basically, this is what we are picking up from our question, right? We are giving some sort of a background to whatever is happening in recycling itself. Now, then I said, while some argue, I use this phrase, that mandatory laws are needed to increase recycling, others believe that such laws are unnecessary. Okay? Now, important thing to notice is like I said, while some argue, that's one side of the picture. I used others believe to show other side of the picture, right? So like it said, on the one hand, on the other hand, similarly I used while some argue, others believe. That's showing two different perspectives, and that's how you use these in your vocabulary. In this essay, I will examine both sides of the issue and argue, okay, look at this, that while mandatory recycling laws can be effective, they should be implemented in conjunction with other measures. So I've made my statement. The reader would know exactly where I stand, what I mean, and what the essay is about, right? That's what I've told them. Like, I will examine that, I will look at both sides of the issue, right? And argue that I'm going to give statements and counter statements. While mandatory recycling laws, look at these three words, they are good, you can use them in your vocabulary, can be effective, they should be implemented in conjunction. In conjunction, that means using two things at the same time with other measures. Okay. When we say measures, that's basically saying some sort of rules or laws. That's what I've used measures for. So basically you need to know synonyms. Measures here, that's being used for, say, even law or rule, or yeah, that's basically what I'm using measures for. So this is basically what the introduction should look like. And mind you, if you take note of this introduction, you can use them in your other essays as well. I don't recommend it, but it's a good framework, right? This is where you start. This is a very good framework for that. Now, so you know what the introduction looks like, right? We've painted the entire picture. We've told them what the background is. We told them where we stand. We also told them like what's happening right now. Now, let's look at BP1, okay? Let's look at BP1. On the one hand, this is the phrase that we spoke about earlier, so we'll use that. On the one hand, it is argued that mandatory recycling laws are necessary to increase the amount of waste that is recycled. That is basically what is told us, that in the question itself, that do you think mandatory recyclings are effective and are they needed? Basically we say that, hey, some believe that it is argued that they are necessary. Now, moving forward, countries such as Sweden and Germany have successfully implemented mandatory recycling laws, resulting in recycling rates of over 50%. So, you see what I did here? I gave an example saying that, mandatory laws, they have been implemented successfully in these countries, and they gave us a result of over 50%. That's a very good number. And Some keywords that you want to keep in mind here in this bit are basically implemented. That's a good word. You want to use that. That's putting something into practice. And we also mentioned resulting in recycling rates of over 50%. Those good words are very nicely used. Use them in your answers. And of course, we gave examples such as Sweden and Germany. See this bit here, this entire bit here itself. This is where it really helps if you know information, if you've retained it, if you've read about it somewhere else. And this is where reading really comes into play with idea generation. So I've used the examples of Germany and Sweden here. Okay, let's move forward. Such laws can be effective in reducing the amount of waste that goes to landfills and conserving resources. See how this word here is used, conserving resources? Instead of saying reducing waste, or instead of saying less trash, I basically said conserving resources. It's a better word that you can use. It is more formal, it is more academic, so use it. Then I've used furthermore. See this little transition. Furthermore, mandatory recycling laws can provide an economic incentive for businesses. Economic incentive for businesses to reduce their waste and improve their sustainability practices. So this line here, it's basically saying that if businesses implement recycling initiatives, they have some sort of a financial benefit out of it. They receive some sort of an incentive, right? Economic incentive, that's what it means. So this is how I've used it. That's basically our BP1. BP1 is all about what's good about mandatory laws, right? Now, we've covered that. Now let's move on to BP2. Now BP2, we start with, on the other hand, this is where we start. Remember we spoke about this in the transition phrases? We are using this. On the other hand, some argue that mandatory recycling laws are not effective in changing consumer behavior. And this is basically the counter statement to what we made in BP1. Okay, while laws can ensure that waste is properly sorted and recycled, they do not necessarily encourage individuals. Encourage, use this word, that's nice. To consume less or to recycle voluntarily. Okay, voluntarily means to do something on your own without being forced. So that's basically, this is how BP2 would put into BP2. We'll basically say, hey, you know what? Although we think it works well, it's maybe not as effective as we thought it is. Okay? Now, to add more, we say, in addition, mandatory recycling laws can be expensive to enforce and may be unpopular with citizens who feel that their personal freedoms are being infringed upon. Okay, look at this word, infringed upon. Now this is some good vocabulary that you want to use for your essays. Basically, if you think about idea generation itself, in BP2, basically what we said, it's not effective. Why is it not effective? Because, it could be, first, it's expensive. We talk about, that it's going to be expensive. Then we also talk about the impact of mandatory recycling on citizens. That, their personal freedoms will be infringed. So, idea generation goes hand in hand with your vocabulary, so it all ties in beautifully. So that's basically our BP2. That's how I would write my BP2 for such a question. Now let's move to BP3. This is where we give our opinion. Now, in my opinion, that makes it super clear. This paragraph is going to be about my opinion. Mandatory recycling laws can be effective in reducing waste and conserving resources, but they should be implemented in conjunction with other measures. See, basically we picked this from paragraph 1, introduction itself. We basically brought the whole thing in here, right? Now, this is our opinion. We gave this statement, right? Now, to back this statement, we are going to give an example. Here, for example, Education campaigns can be used to raise awareness about the benefits of recycling and to encourage individuals to take responsibility for their own waste. This is important. When you give your opinion, you have to back it up. You have to support it with the why. Why do you think it's that way? This is how I'm going to support my statement. Okay. Now another supporting statement. In addition, incentives such as tax breaks or rebates for businesses that reduce their waste can provide an economic incentive for recycling. Boom. That's basically how you give your opinion. You give the opinion, you say, hey, this is wrong, this is how I believe it should be. Then you give reasons why it should be. Give strong reasons, tie them in beautifully, use these phrases. For example, in addition, I use that. And you can also use for example to give an example of something and start with in my opinion. So you see how I'm tying everything all together? It all kind of like ties into each other. That's how your paragraphs should be written. Now, conclusion. When you're concluding the passage, just say in conclusion. In conclusion itself gives the signal that, hey, this is coming to an end. In conclusion, while mandatory recycling laws can be effective in increasing recycling rates, they should be used in combination, I'm using the word in combination here, with other measures such as education campaigns and incentives. Now we are basically tying up the entire essay all together, okay? By taking a balanced approach to waste reduction and recycling, we can ensure that we are doing our part to protect the environment and conserve resources for future generations. So you see how I used all the different vocabulary, all the different phrases, and the idea generation into the conclusion itself? That's how you go about it, man. It's as simple as that. Just takes a little bit of practice, well, maybe a little bit more for some, but practice, yeah. That's how you basically write out the entire essay. Boom, just like that. Now, let's look at the sentence structures that I've used in this essay, okay? Here, just a moment. Let's go with pen. Okay, first of all, I use a simple sentence. These are very simple sentences, just like one-line things, just single idea, nothing fancy in there, okay? Recycling is a process that helps to protect the environment by reducing waste. It's just one idea, it's given there, and that's what it is, right? Simple as that. Then I use a compound sentence. Now this is what a compound sentence looks like. It's a bunch of different ideas put in one sentence. Now here I said, while some argue that mandatory laws are the only way to increase recycling rates, others believe that this would be an unpopular move that could infringe on personal freedoms. I basically gave two sides of the same coin in one sentence. That's what a compound sentence is. It's basically saying, hey, although some believe this is good, others think this is bad. That's a compound sentence. As simple and easy as that. Use them in your essays, okay? Now, let's look at a complex sentence. So in complex sentence, I'm using a bunch of different ideas and I've put them in there. First, here, so let's look at this. In my opinion, governments should take a balanced approach to waste reduction using a combination of education campaigns, incentives, and mandatory laws where necessary. So you see what I did here? In a complex sentence, I've got like a bunch of different ideas and I've put them in there and we are basically using them in just one sentence itself. We are talking about waste reduction, we are talking about how to approach that using education campaigns, incentives, mandatory laws where necessary. Just like that. Now let's also look at some conditional sentences that we used in this essay. Here's a good example. If governments want to see real change in consumer behavior, they need to take a more proactive approach to waste reduction. That's a good example for conditional sentence, right? That's basically saying if you want to see this has to happen. It becomes a condition, right? Use such sentences in your essays. It'll basically it'll put a good impression on the reader and of course the IELTS examiner here, right? Now let's look at passive voice. you don't want to use passive voice as much, but you still want to kind of like show that you've used everything, right? So here's an example. Incentives such as tax breaks and rebates can be offered to encourage individuals and businesses to recycle more of their waste. Here, it's a very passive tone. It's not an active tone. It's just kind of like, just kind of staying away from it. But nonetheless, you have to use this every now and then just to show that you know how to use it. Finally, let's look at the inverted sentence. Only by taking a balanced approach can we hope to see meaningful progress in waste reduction and sustainability practices. Here, what we did was, instead of putting, like the result first, we put what needs to be done first so that, we see the outcomes. That's kind of like, how we inverted this. That's basically an inverted sentence. Simple as that. So these are some sentence structures that, I would highly recommend that you learn and use them in your own essays. Learn how to make these sentences and how to use them, because that's what writing is all about. Now, the most dreaded topic of all, tenses. I know it's scary and I know you don't like it, but hey, that's what I'm here for, to make it simple so that you can understand. Now let's look at present tense, how I use present tense in my essay. And of course, this will also show you like what different kind of tenses that I've used in the entire essay, right? So boom, there you go. Recycling is a process that helps to protect the environment by reducing waste. That's simple present tense, just present tense. Then I also use past tense. In recent years, many governments have introduced educational campaigns and incentives to encourage greater recycling. I talked about the past tense. I've used that. Now I've used present perfect tense. However, despite these efforts, recycling rates remain low in many parts of the world. What's happening right now? So that's, how I use present perfect tense. Then I also use present continuous tense. Here's an example. Many people are unaware of the impact of their actions on the environment. People are doing something and they don't understand what the impacts of that are on the environment. So that's a good way to use that in your essay. Now, finally, let's look at some model verbs. So governments should take a balanced approach to waste reduction, use a combination of education campaigns, incentives, and mandatory laws where necessary. So I used a bunch of model verbs, and that's basically a good example of that. Simple as that. Finally, conditional tenses. So, like we discussed earlier, conditional is, this has to happen for that to happen. That's what conditional is. So if governments want to see real change in consumer behavior, they need to take a more proactive approach to waste reduction. Boom, just like that. Finally, passive voice, we discussed this earlier. We spoke about incentives such as tax breaks and rebates can be offered to encourage individuals and businesses to recycle more of their waste. So there you go. That's basically the end of that. So here, give me just a moment so that you can see my face on the full screen. Boom, there you go. All right, so that's, what the entire video, or the entire, I guess the video is all about. So, you learned basically how to write the entire essay, to what extent, you can agree or disagree, and how to basically make an answer if you don't want to agree with something completely. And in this answer, what I did was like a balanced approach, that. And of course, I showed you how to use vocabulary, transition phases, sentence structures, and tenses, how to use them all together to write a good essay, and of course, idea generation. So that's how you write an essay like that. So I hope you find this useful. And with this entire essay, use it, man. Take it down, write it. And use the framework the way I've written this. You can use the framework and you can make your own essay with that. Simple as that. I don't care. If this helps you, that's all that matters. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and of course we'll get to it. If if you're struggling with something, and if you want to see videos on something that you're struggling with, feel free to reach out to us, and I'll do my best to go over those videos. And if you found this useful, do let us know so that we can make more of it. And if you don't think this is as useful, let us know. We won't make more of it. So yeah, hope you find this useful. If you have a friend who's struggling with writing essays or with IELTS essay, share this with them. This will be helpful for them. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe because there'll be more information coming like this, so don't miss out. Well, take care. Good luck with your exam. I'll see you in the next video.